So I hope everybody is doing okay and is excited to get back to the exciting theme of when we need to kill ourselves and when we don't need to kill ourselves. And I hope you understand that there's a deeper ethical value here that I referred to right at the beginning of the class, which is the flexibility of Judaism when faced with situations of conflicting values. Right? When is it that we can make exceptions to rules that seem to be unbreakable? And that really is the theme of Pikuah Nefesh, the major challenge of Pikuah Nefesh. And I think that has been something that we've seen in real time, in real life, in the past 18 months, as Jewish institutions have had to make decisions regarding whether to stay open, whether to stay closed, what is considered a risk to life, and what is not considered a risk to life. So far, I think many of the sources that we've seen have shown tremendous flexibility when, forget whether a life is at stake, but when somebody is sick, when somebody isn't well, when a pregnant woman just has a craving, so maybe it's that the baby's life is at risk. The sources have been rather flexible in permitting rules that we would consider to be basic Jewish rules, like not eating pig, right? Like you can't think of anything more direct and clear than that rule. And yet, even with that, one is allowed to be flexible. And of course, most of the sources we looked at last week dealt with the question of observing Shabbat, which I submitted might have been the earliest challenge or the earliest formulation of this idea of Pikuach Nefesh, because we have historical evidence that there were some elements of the Second Temple Jewish community that refused to take up arms in military conflicts that occurred on Shabbat, and therefore put their own lives, made their own lives completely vulnerable to attack, and that this was a major conflict in Second Temple Judaism, whether one is permitted to take one's life and protect it, whether one might be able to take up arms on Shabbat in certain circumstances. Now, I just want to review where we left off last week before we start today's source, because it's really important. I want to make sure everybody is with us. I have a funeral today, unfortunately, at about 11:30. So I might have to end class a little bit early today, but we'll be able to get through a lot of material, I'm sure. So here is the on your screens, the text which finally asks the question, where do we know that you are allowed to violate Jewish law when a life is at stake? We've made that assertion, but nobody's really been able to explain where in the Torah it says that all of these laws are conditional. So remember, you have two generations here of rabbis. The first group are the famous early rabbis of the Tannaitic period, the ones you know from the Haggadah, Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Akiba, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. They seem to not know where the principle of overriding the rules of Shabbat in order to save a life, where it comes from. They're asking the question, where is it derived? And we don't even have an answer here. It's possible that the answer was lost, or it's possible they didn't even have an answer. But in a later generation, Rav Yehuda and Shmuel, they say, we have found the source. We know why. And it's a crazy source. And I'll explain why in just a moment. We reviewed it last class, but I just want to remind you all. What is the source? You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances, which a person shall do and live by them. It's a verse in Leviticus 18, and it says, live by them, which Shmuel interprets to mean, and not that he should die by them. And this is the verse that's used to explain why one is permitted to override the rules of Shabbat. But what we did last week is we looked at what is that chapter, Leviticus 18, what is it talking about? My statutes and my ordinances. And the fascinating thing is that all of the laws, almost all of them in Leviticus chapter 18, are laws regarding sexual immorality, incest, and things like that. Well, what's the problem with that? We already learned that the laws of sexual immorality are more important than your own life. That is, we've already learned that you cannot violate the laws of sexual immorality, even if you have to pay for it with your life. So the very verse that Shmuel says gives us permission to violate the laws does not apply to the laws that are mentioned in that precise section. That's what's so crazy about this, to put it bluntly, about this verse. And I want us to notice that and really think about it, especially when we're thinking, well, it's such a beautiful verse, live by them and not die by them. But I think that's why one can say Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael didn't think of that verse, because if they really believed that the laws of sexual immorality were more important, well, how could you draw a verse from the middle of that section in order to make a claim that says precisely the opposite? So that's where we left off last week. But this is a conclusive section, meaning there's no argument after the verse is presented. We are sort of stuck with this verse as the foundational principle by which we affirm Pikuah Nefesh. The foundational verse is, the Torah says, my laws and my statutes, and you will live by them. Live by them means your life takes priority. Now, we're going to look at the main text that might take us the next two classes to review. And it deals with the three exceptions to the laws of Pikuach Nefesh. We already reviewed those laws, and they are murder, idol worship, and forbidden sexual relations. So Violette, would you start us off and read where it says the Gemara now considers? And I apologize, Violette, I'll be interrupting you frequently.
Okay. The Gemara asks, and should one not transgress the prohibition?
Right up here, this section. The Gemara now considers.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
The Gemara now considers which prohibitions are permitted in times of moral danger. Rabbi Yohanan says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadak, the sages who discussed the issue counted the votes of those assembled and concluded in the upper story of the house of Nitza in the city of Lod. With regard to all transgressions in the Torah, if a person is told, transgress this prohibition and you will not be killed, he may transgress that prohibition and not be killed, because the preserving of his own life overrides all the Torah prohibitions. This is the halacha concerning the prohibitions except for those of idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. Concerning those prohibitions, one must allow himself to be killed rather than transgress them.
Thank you, Violette. So I'd like everybody here to notice a few things about this passage. First of all, there's a vote. Those of you who were studying with me in my last series on intermarriage, remember that there was a principle of intermarriage at the time of Hillel and Shammai that also came down to a vote. It was a vote, in the attic of the house of Nitza in the city of Lod. And what was the issue at hand in the parliament, right? When does the preservation of life take importance over a law in the Torah? And when does the law in the Torah take importance over your life? But I want us to pay very close attention to these words: transgressions in the Torah. It does not say laws in the Torah. Here in Yoma, it says, this is the first verse we learned a few weeks ago, there is no halacha that stands in the way of saving a life. Halacha means, in this context, a law. It could be a positive law, such as observe circumcision. That's a positive law. So no halacha that stands in the way of saving a life. It could also be a negative law. What's a negative law? An easy one: thou shalt not steal. Stealing or circumcision, you can violate both of them when a life is at stake. But look at this interesting word that I want to just highlight here. The word prohibition or transgressions. That is not halacha. This is a more, let's say, well-defined and limited category of law. Transgressions. That means circumcision, which is a positive commandment, may not apply here. All they're talking about in the attic of Nitza is the thou shalt nots. If you have to do something, if you're told do something or I'll kill you, that the Torah says is forbidden to do, we're going to have a vote, and the vote says you're allowed to transgress it, except for 3 circumstances. But there's no discussion here, perhaps, on the positive commandments in the Torah. Please note that and keep it in your minds, because that's something I really want to pay attention to in this series. Part of what has happened in the debate around Pikuah Nefesh today, when a school closes, when a yeshiva closes and says we're closing for Pikuah Nefesh, right? Or we're staying open for Pikuah Nefesh, what is the law? We reviewed this last week. I think I asked the same question. What is the law that's being counterbalanced against the law of saving a life because of a deadly virus? Violette, what is the law? What is going on in the yeshiva? What's so important in the yeshiva that requires it to stay open even when there's a mortal danger? You have to unmute, Violette. I need you to, there you go. What's the law, Violette, that's being...
To study.
That's right. That's right. Don't say no. Yeah, I say yes. You're right. Is that a transgression? No.
No.
The law of Talmud Torah is a positive commandment. It's not a negative commandment. You shall not study Torah. Doesn't say that anywhere. All it says is you are required to study Torah. V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. You shall teach them to your children. So this presents a real challenge, because if I'm the head of a yeshiva and I'm trying to say, okay, let me look at this source that we're about to learn to see whether I should shut down the yeshiva or not, maybe I can say, well, it doesn't apply, because learning Torah is not in the realm of transgression, a positive commandment. And maybe I could say, you should all think about this. Maybe I should say that positive commandments, fulfilling positive commandments, are more important than human life. And I think some people may have thought that, or that may have been their justification for why they should keep synagogues open and why they should keep schools open. Because these laws of Pikuah Nefesh only apply to transgressions, not positive commandments. Okay, so now we're going to keep reading, but let's remember what was just stated. In the attic, there was a vote, and the vote was the transgressions of the Torah. All of them can be violated when life is at stake, except for three. What are they? Again, idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. Okay, Violette, next paragraph.
The Gemara asks, and should one not transgress the prohibition of idol worship to save his life?
Oh, okay. So a challenge is offered, everybody. Should one not transgress the prohibition of idol worship to save his life? Come on. It's just bowing down to an idol. You're telling me that I have to die rather than bow down to an idol? That's the challenge the Talmud, the Talmud cites. Okay. And why is that a challenge? Go ahead.
But isn't it taught in a Baraita? Rabbi Ishmael said, from where is it derived that if a person is told, worship idols and you will not be killed, from where is it derived that he should worship the idol and not be killed? The verse states, you shall keep my statutes and my judgments, which a person shall do, and he shall live by them. Leviticus 18. Thereby teaching that the mitzvot were given to provide life, but they were not given so that one will die due to their observance.
So Violette, thank you. So everyone, just so you understand what this means, this paragraph. At the beginning of today's class, we were here in source number 3, which was a source that said, where do we learn that life comes first? And the answer was, a person shall do and live by them. That's the answer. What do we learn from that verse? That your life takes priority. So the Baraita begins by asking a very logical question. You just told me that life takes priority because the Torah says live by them. Well, how can you tell me that that verse does not apply to idol worship? Where do we learn that idol worship is an exception to that rule? Is everybody with me? The verse says live by them. It doesn't say live by them except if an idol is placed before you. It just says live by them. So if it says live by them, why are we talking about 3 exceptions to that rule? Either it applies or it does not apply. So Rabbi Yishmael says, here's the more precise learning. The first thing he says is, yes, I agree. We have this verse that says, live by them. But Rabbi Yishmael is going to continue, and here in the second part of the Braita that Norm Stern, I'm going to ask you to read. And this second part of the Braita, or you, Simone, you can read it too. The second part of the Braita is the exception. So go ahead, Simone. Can you unmute and help us with the reading? I hear you. Okay. So the Braita continues.
The Baraita continues, one might have thought that it is permitted to worship the idol in this circumstance, even in public, that is, in the presence of many people.
Right? One might have said to oneself, listen, the law says live by them. So if it says live by them and someone puts an idol of Buddha in front of me, I better, I got to pray because my life comes first. But the verse states,
Therefore, the verse states, neither shall you profane my holy name, but I will be hallowed among the children of Israel.
Keep going.
I am the Lord who sanctifies you.
Very good. Okay, let me stop you there, Simone. Excellent. There's another verse in the Torah. Says Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, we learned the first verse. You shall live by them. I understand, but there's another verse. Lo techalelu et shem kodshi v'nikdashti betoch b'nei Yisrael. You shall not profane my name, and I will be hallowed among the children of Israel. The word hallow, which is a weird word, I prefer the Hebrew, which is the root kodesh, v'nikdashti, kodshi. One of the principles of Judaism is that some things must be done in public and some things cannot be done in private. All of you know this who go to synagogue and maybe for a daily service and know that we can't say certain prayers without a minyan, right? A minyan creates a public space. 10 people who are gathered makes something public. And one of the prayers, for instance, that you can't say, if I was going to ask you all to say, here, I'll just ask you, Simone, name the first prayer that comes to mind that you can't say without a minyan.
Kaddish.
Very good. Now, isn't it interesting you said Kaddish, which is what I'm guessing most of you would say. And this verse is Kodshi Venikdashti. Do you see the root? Kaddish, Kodshi Venikdashti. There are certain prayers that are so holy that they must be said only in a public setting. Because a public setting is a place where God's presence can be sanctified. In private, yes, you can sanctify God's presence, but only to yourself. But when 10 people are gathered, our words, our actions have much more power. Let me say that one more time. When 10 people are gathered, i.e., in a public setting, our words and our actions have much more power. God can be really sanctified in a public setting. At the same time, God can also be really mechalel. Do you know that word from mechalel Shabbos? Have you heard that word, mechalel Shabbos? Somebody who desecrates the Sabbath is called mechalel Shabbos in yeshivish talk. When there's a minyan, God's name can be desecrated and God's name can be sanctified. And so Rabbi Ishmael says, since we have a verse that says God's name must be sanctified and can never be desecrated, that means one may not worship idols even when one's life is at stake, except in private.
Except in what?
In private.
In private, right? Why? Because when you're in a private setting, as I repeated twice 2 minutes ago, your words and your actions don't have as much power. If I'm alone in my room and choose to worship Buddha, nobody will know. If someone comes to me in private and says, if you don't worship Buddha, I will kill you, what is Rabbi Ishmael's position? Do I say, kill me, or do I worship the idol? Rabbi Ishmael says, worship the idol. Because if you worship the idol, you will not be in violation of Lo techalalu et shem kodshi v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. You will not be violating this law that says, don't profane my name, you have to hallow me in the presence of the children of Israel. That's the view of Rabbi Ishmael. But if I get called to the town square and there's a big statue of Buddha in the middle of the town square, and the Torquemada is in front of me and says, I don't know why the Torquemada would care about Buddha, so let's just say it's a big crucifix, and he says, Rabbi Grover, especially Rabbi Grover, you're the leader of a religious community, you worship this crucifix or your life is over. What does Rabbi Ishmael do? What does Rabbi Ishmael say? You submit to the sword. Your life is put, your life does not come first. And his source for that is Lo techalalu et shem kodshi v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. If you worship an idol in public, you will desecrate God's name in public. And that's why the verse that says live by them does not apply.
That leaves things wide open. We can do lots of things in private then.
That's right. Well, remember, already up until now, when your life is at stake, you can do whatever you want. We're only talking about the 3 exceptions. But Rabbi Ishmael just narrowed those, or at least one of those 3. He narrowed one of those 3 exceptions and says, no, the prohibition against idol worship only comes first when it's in public, when you're being asked to violate that law in public. But when you're in private, you should worship the idol and you should sacrifice your life. So I want us to note in this paragraph, this is beautiful Talmudic comparison of values. Here it's almost a triangulation of values. Let me explain. There's one religious impulse that says, observe all the commandments. Right? It's God's word. God says do something, do it. That's the first religious impulse. The second religious impulse says, but your life comes first. So if your life is at stake, maybe don't observe the commandment. Protect your life. That's the second religious impulse. And now a third religious impulse that says, if other people see you violating a commandment, God's name might be profaned. And it says very clearly in 10 Commandments, don't profane God's name. You have 3 Jewish values. First of all, that everything you do, good or bad, in public can have an effect on other people and can also desecrate God's name in public or sanctify God's name in public. Number 2, my life is holy. I need to protect my life. And number 3, the commandments are holy, and I need to protect the commandments. So all 3 of these are sort of like bumper cars, bumping up against each other. And Rabbi Ishmael is caught in the middle, and he has a solution. His solution is, with regards to idol worship at least, you should submit your life only if you're being asked to worship an idol in public, in front of 10 people. But if it's in private, your life comes first. Morley, your hand is up. Wait, I need you to unmute. Whoops. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Try unmuting again. Oh, I did it again. Sorry. Unmute.
Okay,
Go.
my question is, what constitutes worship?
It's not in this section of Talmud, right? It's a very good question. What does it mean to worship the idol? Bow down, swear loyalty. I don't think that in this class, I haven't really prepared actually to answer that question,
Well,
to
it seemed to me-
be able to define it, but I think it's an excellent question. What does it
seemed to
mean?
me that the rabbis of blessed memory, as brilliant as they were, we find that plausible here.
What do you mean?
But they find a way of saying, well, if you just do this and it looks like worship, it really isn't worship.
Maybe. I think there's a certain degree here, Morley. I hope you agree with me. There's a certain degree here of public perception.
I understand. I think
Right?
if somebody
If-
saw a rabbi standing up there,
Yes.
bowing down, it would
Yes.
immediately say, oh,
Yes.
this is kosher.
Yeah. The sages were very, very aware of public perceptions of things and the difference between doing things in private and doing things publicly. And we saw that, by the way, in an earlier source, when it came to desecrating Shabbat in order to save a life, the Talmud says the rabbi has to do it. Why? To show that this is such an important principle in Judaism that even the rabbi is going to violate the law in order to preserve a life. And I think here too, Morley, part of what might be defined as idol worship is what the public perceives it to be. If I see somebody worshiping an idol, whatever that means, if my interpretation is they are worshiping an idol, God's name will therefore be disparaged.
Okay, so that means that a rabbi can't walk into a church.
Well, let's not get into that, but I accept the challenge next week, at least, to be better prepared to answer that question. What does it mean to worship an idol, right? It's a great question. Okay, so I hope everybody is with me now in this, where we are now in the Talmudic discussion. The 3 values bumping up against each other, and Rabbi Ishmael finding a way to navigate these values. I just love learning Talmud because of this. I really do, because this is just another example of trying to find a way through the messiness of life, trying to navigate through the messiness of life. And Rabbi Ishmael saying, I know how to do it. I think I figured out a way to navigate through the messiness of this situation. The problem is Rabbi Ishmael was not crowned Pope of the Jewish people. So we're going to see now some disagree with Rabbi Ishmael, and that is Rabbi Eliezer's disagreement with him. So let me see. Adele, could you read the response of Rabbi Yishmael to this baraita. It begins in the paragraph, the Gemara answers.
The Gemara answers, those in the upper story of the house of Nitzah stated their opinion in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, as it is taught in a baraita that Rabbi Eliezer says, it is stated, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might.
Okay, so let me stop you there, Adele. Rabbi Eliezer has a different point of view. Rabbi Eliezer's verse is different than Rabbi Yishmael's verse. Rabbi Yishmael's verse, which he is citing, remember, in order to say there is an exception to the laws of when you submit your life, right? What is the verse that he cites? I am the Lord who sanctifies you, and therefore one is allowed to worship an idol in private, but not in public. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees. He says, I have a different verse that says why you should submit your life rather than worship an idol. What is his verse? It's one that I hope most of you recognize. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. What's that from, Adele?
Shema.
The Shema. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha uvechol nafshecha uvechol me'odecha. This verse always has had a martyr. I have to find my English word. A martyrological. That's probably not an English word, but I hope some of you know what I'm talking about. It's a martyrological meaning. In other words, that verse has often been used in Jewish tradition to justify martyrdom. Why? I mean, when we read these words, love the Lord your God, it sounds so nice and sweet, right? Oh, love God. Yeah, it's nice to love God. But some of you may remember that Rabbi Akiva, remember when his skin is being flayed by the Romans. Remember, we read his story on Yom Kippur. He says, I'm so grateful while he's being killed, because now I have learned that I have fulfilled the commandment to love God with all my nefesh, all my soul, which can also be translated as all my flesh. I've now fulfilled the commandment to love God with all my flesh. So this verse is actually, in rabbinic literature, well known to be associated with submitting your life in order to say that you love God. So how would you, before we read on, Adele, how would you explain to everybody why this verse might mean, like this is what Rabbi Eliezer believes, right? But before we read how he connects the dots, how do you explain, Adele, why does this verse suggest that you should be killed rather than submit to idolatry, even in private? Think about it from a very basic, think about it from Rabbi Akiva's perspective. Well, the verse says, love God with all of your nefesh.
Okay, so.
So if somebody says, go worship an idol, and I say, I refuse, is that not loving God with all of my nefesh? Aren't I fulfilling the very words of the Shema, the most important, some of the most important verses in the whole Torah? What do these words mean if they don't mean die rather than worship something else other than God? Love the Lord your God with all of your nefesh, with all of your body. We translate the word nefesh as soul, but nefesh actually means flesh, very commonly in rabbinic literature. Translate that word to flesh. Love God with all of your flesh. Well, how can I love God with all of my flesh? It seems to me there's one way that would do that better than all others, and that is to refuse to worship anything else other than God, even at the cost of my own life. That is Rabbi Eliezer's contention. And do you see how that butts up against Rabbi Yishmael's verse? Rabbi Yishmael wants to say, no, you preserve your life. You only, even if you're being told to worship an idol, you worship it. The only exception to the rule is if it's a public act, right? That's Rabbi Yishmael. If you're being asked to worship the crucifix or the idol in public, okay, then you submit to the sword. But Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and says, no, the Shema says, love the Lord your God with all your flesh. It doesn't say only when you're alone. It doesn't say only when you're in public. It says you love the Lord your God always with all your flesh. And therefore, so now we can read further, Adele,
Okay.
if
it is stated with all your soul, why is it also stated with all your might, which indicates with all your material possessions? And if it is stated with all your might, why is it also stated with all your soul? One of these clauses, sorry, I couldn't see that. Clauses seem to be superfluous.
So the Shema says, Bechol levavcha, Bechol nafshecha, Uvechol me'odecha. Why does it say the three things? With all your might, with all your flesh, with all your material possessions. Why? And here's his answer, Rabbi Eliezer.
Rather, this serves to teach that if you have a person whose body is more precious to him than his property, it is therefore stated with all your soul.
It's because a person might value their body more than their material possessions. So they'll say, look, I'll give you all my money if you don't make me bow down to this idol, but I'm not going to give you my life. Well, the verse says you can't say that. You can't say that. You have to submit all your material possessions and your own life. Keep going, Adele.
Okay. That person must be willing to sacrifice even his life to sanctify God's name.
Right.
And if you have a person whose property is more precious to him than his body, it is therefore stated with all your might. That person must even be prepared to sacrifice all his property for the love of God. According to the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, one must allow himself to be killed rather than worship an idol.
So Rabbi Eliezer says if you're a person who values their life more than their money, doesn't make a difference. The Shema covers you. You have to submit yourself rather than worship the idol. If you're a person who values their money more than their life, the Shema covers you too. You're not allowed to say to the person, kill me, but don't take my money. No, you can't say that. Bechol nafshecha, bechol levavcha, uvechol me'odecha. Everything you have in order to not worship the idol. That is Rabbi Eliezer's view. He's much more of a martyr than Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael tries to narrow. Rabbi Eliezer says, no way. The Shema is a declaration that there is nothing more important to a Jew than the exclusive worship of God. And if you can't get that, if you can't show that even in private, you don't deserve to live. Okay, very extreme kind of view, but still his own way of navigating the triple challenge here. The public and private for him plays no role. For Rabbi Eliezer, idolatry is just so serious of a transgression that it requires submission of one's life, no matter the circumstance. Thank you, Adele. Thank you for reading. Okay. Let's see. Who shall I pick on next? Marcy, are you there? Are you able to unmute? Okay. Can you read now? So now we've settled the issue of where do we get the source that there's an exception to the rule when it comes to idol worship. And now we move to the next exception, the laws of sexual immorality. Why are they more important than your own life? Why do I have to protect them even when my own life is at stake? Go ahead, Marcy.
From where is it derived that one must allow himself to be killed rather than to transgress the prohibition of forbidden sexual relations and the prohibition of bloodshed?
Okay. So two he's going to tackle here. The Torah, the Talmud asks two questions. Where do we learn that I should be killed rather than transgress the laws of forbidden sexual relations and the prohibition of bloodshed? So go ahead, Marcy.
This is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, as it is taught in a Baraita. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi says, with regard to the rape of a betrothed young woman, it is
okay. What is it? The rape of a betrothed young woman. Why is that interesting, Marcy? Why is that a serious case? Because betrothed means she's somebody else's
wife.
Exactly. So one of the laws of sexual relations is it is forbidden for a man to take advantage. I mean, listen, we're dealing with 3,000 years ago, okay, or 2,000 years ago. So I know that we're going to look at this source and go, oh my God, are they implying that the rape of a non-betrothed young woman is okay? So let's not go there. Let's just say that in their days, the rape of a woman who was married, betrothed basically means married, is a very serious transgression, right? It's in the Ten Commandments, folks. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, right? So this is worse than coveting. You actually raped a betrothed young woman. So the law of sexual immorality has been broken. So go ahead.
But you shall do nothing to the young woman. The young woman has committed no sin worthy of death.
Okay, so that's in Deuteronomy, when it discusses the case, it says she is harmless. Now, why might I have thought that I mean, this is a crazy thing. She was raped. Why would she be guilty? Why do you think, Marcy?
Because she's committing adultery, even though it wasn't voluntary on her part.
Exactly. Because one might say, well, hold on. She also is being unfaithful to her husband. So maybe she should also be punished. But the Torah says, no, she has committed no sin, because presumably the man overpowered her. the Torah doesn't use the word rape, but this is understood to be a situation of rape. So she is held harmless. Makes sense, but he is guilty. But then continue, Marcy, with what the rest of the verse says.
For as when a man rises against his neighbor and slays him, so too with this matter.
So the Torah says something really interesting here. It makes a comparison. It says, raping a woman is like murdering somebody. Obviously, you don't hold the person who is murdered accountable for being murdered. Right? That's ridiculous. He was innocent. A person came up to him and killed them. And it's the same with a rape. Now, why? Well, here, look at the question, Marcy. Read the next sentence.
But why would the verse mention murder in this context? But what do we learn here from a murderer?
So it's a very interesting way. That's the statement the Talmud is making is, why is it saying that a rape is like a murder? Why doesn't it just say a rape is wrong? And if the rapist gets caught, he has sinned, but she has not sinned. What is the need to compare this case with the case of murder? Right? Is it just for emphasis, or are we actually trying to learn something here? Is there some teaching here that the Torah is trying to provide? So go ahead, Marcy, let's just read one more paragraph.
Now, the mention of murder came in order to teach a halacha about the betrothed young woman. And it turns out that, in addition, it derives a halacha from that.
So it is. The reason why there's a comparison between the rape and the murder is because there's a law that we're supposed to learn from this. Go ahead. What is the law that we're supposed to learn?
The Torah juxtaposes the case of a murderer to the case of a betrothed young woman to indicate that, just as in the case of a betrothed young woman, one may save her at the cost of the rapist's life. So too, in the case of a murderer, one may save the potential victim at the cost of
So everybody be with me here, because we're going to end with this, and I want us to understand this point very, very clearly. There's something that this passage is taking for granted, because it's so obvious, right, that they don't even need a verse in the Torah in order to figure it out. What is it that's so obvious? That if somebody tells me, go murder that guy, or I'm going to kill you, that you should be that you should be killed. Why is it obvious? Because whether I die or he dies, somebody dies. So the principle of the equality of all life is so foundational to the Torah that it doesn't even need a verse to teach us that if somebody says to go murder somebody else, you don't do it, even if you're going to get killed. Now, I know we can get into a whole discussion of, but what if the person you're being asked to kill is really, he's on his deathbed? Like, you try and come up with an extreme circumstance in order to say, come on, I'm more important than that guy. I should save my life and let him be killed. Let's not go there just for the moment. For now, let's just accept the idea that it doesn't take that much moral, philosophical deducement to arrive at a principle that you shouldn't kill somebody else if in order to save your own life, right? You should instead be killed, because at the end of the day, one person will die, and who is to say that you're more important than the next guy? All lives are equal, right? You can argue with that point, but it's not a complicated point. Once we accept that in a situation of murder, I should be willing to submit my own life, let's take that for granted, then the Torah makes a connection to the story of a raped woman. That is why the Torah says rape is like murder. because she is innocent. And if you rape her, it's like taking her life. And better you should die than take the life of a betrothed woman. In a way, it's a very sophisticated, actually very advanced kind of view from a psychological perspective of what rape is. If you speak to survivors of sexual abuse, from children all the way up to adults, you learn that rape is murder. Let me say that again, because it's important. If you speak to survivors of sexual abuse, especially children, but really all the way up, you learn that rape is a form of murder because a person's life changes forever. And sometimes, actually often, they live with a trauma that they can never, ever, ever overcome. They can just learn to live with it. And the rabbis say the Torah knew it. The Torah knows that. That's why it said raping and murder are the same. So this to me is a brilliant, brilliant text. Very sophisticated in terms of what it's stating. The reason why you die rather than rape a person is because it's the same as killing them. So you just die rather than rape somebody else, because rape is murder. Isn't that incredible that the Talmud says that? Where do we know that the exception that we submit our lives for the sake of sexual immorality? Where do we learn it from? We learn it from the case of murder, because murder and sexual immorality are the same thing. It takes away your life, whether in a physical way or in a spiritual way, it is the same. Wow. Not a statement you would have expected from a bunch of men living 2,000 years ago who may not have understood the kind of things we understand today about psychology and rape victims, everything that we've learned. Not a statement you might expect, but they knew it. We don't have a verse for sexual immorality that says that you submit your life. We have something deeper, something bigger. We have a verse that says sexual immorality is like murder. Now, you might say to me, look, this is specifically the situation of rape, right? There are many prohibitions against sexual immorality. Not all of them involve rape, right? But when the rabbis look at sexual immorality, that is the case that comes to mind. That's what we just read. That's what Marcy just read. When it's sexual immorality, it's rape. That's what they're thinking of. And rape is murder. The Torah says rape is like murder. So if I care about murder and my life is not more important than saving a murder victim, then my life is also not more important than saving a rape victim. Okay. Have I left you a little bit on the edge of your seat here with some interesting stuff? I'm reading your comments, Rose. Yeah, you're right. So I'll see you all next week. I'm sorry we have to end class a little bit early today because of the funeral I have to do, but we're going to continue, because now the rabbis, the next stage they're going to do is to say, okay, well, since we've accepted that rape is like murder, well, where's the verse that says I can't murder in order to save my own life? So you're going to see it's very interesting. It comes down to what I sort of said earlier, which is we don't need a verse. It's so foundational to Torah that you don't choose one life over another life, we don't even need a verse, because who's to say one person's blood is redder than the others? Okay, but that we'll leave to next week. Thank you, everybody. I hope it was a little bit challenging today to follow along, but I hope that the general picture is one that you understand. Have a great day.